Well, good evening, everybody. Hope everyone is doing well. Welcome into the live stream presentation tonight here on my YouTube channel. It's good to see some people already hanging out and waiting to be a part of this momentous occasion. I say it's momentous because this is KT Shively's first time on the programming. So we need to welcome them in this evening. Thank you both for being on. I want to give a little bit of bio for both of you before we get rolling here into the book. But I'm so appreciative to see your faces again on a live stream / video. KT Shively is Associate Professor of History at Virginia Commonwealth University. They are the author of Nature's Civil War, Common Soldiers and the Environment in 1862, co-editor of the Second Manassas Campaign, which I still have my copy here, and there's all kinds of notes in the margins and things like that, because you become a PhD student, you suddenly have like notes and margins of every book that you own. And they are the author of a chapter in that work entitled Management Most Wretched, Logistical Self-Destruction in the Army of Virginia. And once again, Gary Gallagher joins us. I think, Gary, this is like your fifth time on my stuff.
We've had a great time over the years on numerous occasions, John. I don't remember how many.
Yeah, it's always a good time having Gary on. Gary is the John L. Null Professor of History Emeritus at the University of Virginia, and author or editor of more books than I can count, and I have an accounting degree, including Lee and His Army in Confederate History and the Shenandoah Valley Campaign of 1864, amongst many others. The title of his chapter in the Second Manassas Campaign is The Tide of War Has Been Rolled Back, Second Manassas in Confederate Perspective. And for everyone who is tuning in or who will be tuning in, please find pinned at the top of the chat a link directly to the book from UNC Press. So KT, I would love to start with you because this is your first time on and you co-edited this work. How did this work come about? Why the Second Manassas Campaign?
Well, first, thanks for having me on, John. It's great to be here. So I came onto this project a little bit later than my co-author, Carrie. Carrie had edited, how many volumes did Carrie do with you, Gary? 1 or 2?
1. We did 1 together.
And then Gary stepped away and Carrie did a volume on her own. And the military campaigns of the Civil War series with UNC was, to me, just the greatest military series out there. When I started studying the Civil War, it was one of the series that really drew me to become a scholar of the Civil War. It was one of the things that drew me to study with Gary. Gary was my PhD advisor at University of Virginia. And honestly, I had a dream of being a participant in the series, which I was. And when I noticed that Carrie was editing on her own, I thought, she really needs a co-editor. It's just too much work for one person. So honestly, I insinuated myself in it and just contacted Carrie and said, is there a possibility that you might want a co-editor? I knew that she was going to start working on the Second Manassas volume, which actually Gary can probably tell you more about the very beginning origin story of this volume. But Carrie said that she would love to have a co-editor. I'm a military historian myself. And so I came on board, and at that point, I think some of the essayists had already been, gathered, but we sort of finished out the lineup together. But yeah, turning to the origins of Second Manassas as a topic, Gary, I believe this was one of the conferences that you did, right?
It was. The military campaigns came out of a series of conferences that began at Penn State and then transferred to UVA when I went to UVA. And the original idea was to provide a forum that would make people think about military history in a broader framework that would include reciprocal ties between the home front and the battlefront, and which would include National Park Service historians, graduate students, and established scholars. Wanted to have all 3 kinds of those voices present in these books. And And that's how it developed. First one came out in the mid-90s, and they came out about one a year. And we did have a conference on Second Bull Run Manassas. And to my, let's just say, there weren't enough good essays that came out. It's the only conference we had that didn't have enough good essays to make a book. And so it just went by the wayside. And it was very disappointing. But here we go. Carrie and KT came through and have filled the gap that has been present there. It should have come out in the late 1990s. That's when the book would have come out if the conference had yielded enough good essays, but it didn't. And again, it was the only one that didn't. It's really interesting.
Gary, do you think the book would have looked a little different, been made up a little bit differently because of the evolution of the field itself, the evolution of the craft?
It might have looked a little different, but really these volumes going all the way back to the beginning have very different kinds of essays in them, and which this volume does as well. I can't, there isn't an essay in this book that wouldn't have worked in the book that I would have imagined in the late 1990s. I think every topic in this book is something that would have struck me as a good way to try to get at some aspect of the campaign.
KT, how did you come to the conclusion that you wanted to write your particular chapter? What was the spark that was like, I want to write about logistics in the Army of Virginia?
You know, it actually was kind of a slog coming to this topic. We started researching for these essays in just the height of COVID. It was extremely difficult to do archival research. And I've been writing a book about Jubal Early for the past 15 years. I did just turn it into the press, though. So,
huzzah! That's great. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, that happened last Friday. So I have been celebrating. But so I initially thought that I might write an essay focused on him. But I just was casting around, and finally I was able to get an appointment with the National Archives. And when I did so, and I started digging into the archival research they had on the Army of Virginia, the story was so clearly about logistics to me. It really just leapt out. That's the direction I had to go. That's what the evidence said. I mean, right, Gary, this is what you always said to me, just go where the evidence leads you.
That's my mantra. It really is. You can't go wrong if that's what you do.
Right.
That's my belief.
Right. So that's where I had to go. That's what I saw in the evidence. And, but you know, it was a process, because at that point we already knew that Cesaly Zander was writing an article, writing her essay on Pope. And so I was like, well, I'm not sure we need a second essay on him. But it was, you know, the logistical story was the story that came out, and it's not only focused on Pope, but I think that's one of the strengths of this volume. There's so much interpretive space to look at Second Manassas because there's been so little written on it. And I think my essay is a revisionist look at Pope insofar as it looks at him. And I also think there's room for contrasting interpretations in these volumes, which is one of the things that I admire about them so much.
That's always been true in the series. People have disagreed with one another, which is great.
I just did an interview earlier today, and Jonathan Noyalis was a part of that, and he was talking about how history needs to be a forum. And you can really see it in some of these edited works like this, the forum in paper form where people are disagreeing or they are slightly moving to one sector of the history compared to someone else, or they're coming at it in a different direction. I think that's a beautiful part of edited works, is you get to see several people who are having a conversation through the pages in different ways, and really help to progress the field, hopefully, and especially with Second Bull Run with this piece.
I was going to say, I also think we need to be a little bit more comfortable with disagreeing. I mean, that's sort of what scholarship is all about, right? Is that we're going to bring contrasting interpretations and look at different evidence and look at evidence in new ways. I mean, that was one of the things that really struck me when I came to this evidence. I noticed that like diary entries that have been looked at again and again, and Jacob Cox's memoirs, they always get sort of interpreted in one way. And I took a look at them and I said, I really see them the opposite way. There really is a different way to look at these things. So I think, yeah, we could all get a little bit more comfortable with disagreeing in collegial ways.
Mm-hmm. And Gary, you've written so much on the Confederate war effort over the years and spoken about it at length. What was it that you wanted to get across in your chapter right away for the reader? What was the main kind of thesis or idea you wanted the reader to be introduced to when you talk about the Army of Northern Virginia just before Second Bull Run or Second Manassas?
Well, I came late to this. I think I came to it because at one point it seemed that there weren't as many essays sort of on the Confederate side of things. And so in conversation with the editors, I offered to write something on the campaign from a Confederate perspective. It's always seemed to me that Second Bull Run Manassas, and I use Second Manassas in my essay because I'm quoting mainly Confederate sources, and it would have been weird to go back and forth between Bull Run and Manassas. But it seems to me to get lost in between the 7 days and Antietam. And one of the things I really wanted to do in my essay was try to get people to think of the campaigning between June and September 1862 as one sprawling campaign in 3 distinct acts, but all very closely related. Act 1 is the 7 days, which blunted McClellan's offensive. Act 2 is Second Manassas, which reoriented the war to the Potomac frontier. And Act 3 is the Maryland campaign, which took the fighting into the United States for the first time with the Army of Northern Virginia. A lot of people at the time on the Confederate side interpreted it that way. They saw it as one major campaign with these 3 key parts. I also saw it as a very critical element in Lee's making the Army of Northern Virginia his army and changing the culture. Every army has a culture, and the culture was Johnston's culture in that army before Lee arrived. And this was the campaign where he got rid of a lot of senior officers and where he settled on his 3 principal officers as Longstreet, Jackson, and Stuart, and began to shape the army in his image and make it a very aggressive army rather than a reactive army. The third thing that I wanted to emphasize was just how powerfully John Pope's statements, to me, the interesting question is, did he do all the things he said he was going to do? He didn't. He did some of them, but he didn't do all of them. But the fact that he said them, together with what both Congress with the Second Confiscation Act and Lincoln was doing regarding emancipation, marked a real turning point in the war, where the war took a decided shift toward a much, much harder kind of war, not George McClellan's kind of war, not Joseph Johnston's kind of war, but a war that put everything in the Confederacy on the table, everything relating to their slavery-based society. And so those are the 3 themes that I got at in my essay. Look at it as part of a broader campaign, look at the change in the Army of Northern Virginia with Lee in charge, and look at just how this campaign resonated behind the lines and with the Confederate government issuing these really sharply worded stink bombs directed toward the United States. It's really an interesting radicalization of the war in significant ways in late July and August 1862.
Katie, you spoke about that in your chapter as far as what Pope is saying, what he's thinking he's going to do, or what he's hoping to do. What are those aims of his that he's hoping to put out into the field that really gets the Confederate war effort moving more aggressively in the field?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So my essay takes a different approach to understanding Pope's general orders. So the traditional interpretation of them had been that Pope was really sort of a pawn of the Republican Party, and that Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and others were really prompting him to kind of double down on confiscation and punishing Confederate civilians, etc. And while I do agree that he was certainly, playing political games in Washington, and I think, again, Cesaly Zander's essay does a good job of showing how he interacted with politicians in that period. My essay is really looking at logistics. And what I found was that Pope's general orders really discreetly and clearly corresponded to the logistical problems that he was trying to figure out how to sort through. So things like getting enough forage for the horses, things like all of the his 3 corps and all the way down to the regimental level had far too much baggage train, far too many wagons in their baggage trains, to a ridiculous level. Even his cavalry were performing reconnaissance raids with just grossly ballooned baggage trains in tow. And he was having a very difficult time getting his, commanding officers to understand that he wanted to get the army on the move. He wanted to consolidate it. He wanted to be able to be kind of an offensive machine. And it was impossible with this amount of logistical backlog. And he kept asking and ordering, and things weren't happening. So finally, he started escalating. And his general orders addressed these things. And part of the way he understood the problem was that his communications and supply lines were being sabotaged by Confederate civilians, by guerrillas. And this was something that he had experience with from Missouri. And he saw this problem playing out again. And so he, asked Lincoln specifically, if it would be okay, essentially, to say, we're going to shoot these people. If civilians are acting like soldiers, then they can be shot, right? And he checked to make sure that would be okay. So he's issuing these orders, and part of what I talk about is they're in line with Republican Party policy. He's not overstepping the policy that, he's not overstepping confiscation. He's emphasizing it. He's saying we're going to enforce it, which is something that McClellan didn't do. McClellan enforced confiscation, but he didn't emphasize it. He didn't, he made sure that there wasn't any plundering. He kept things under guard. And Pope wanted to do away with all of that. But I think what Gary's essay shows that's very, very important is that it doesn't matter what Pope's intention was. The effect was to escalate the war, was to escalate this back and forth that the U.S. and Confederacy had already been engaging in, where civilians were becoming increasingly part of the war through guerrilla warfare, through hangings on either side. And his general orders were perceived and accepted as an escalation of this, right? So that may not have been Pope's interpretation. And he was kind of surprised by the response. And, I think one of the really telling things is that Confederates perceived that Pope was giving his soldiers license to plunder with his general orders. And that wasn't Pope's intent at all, actually. In fact, when he saw that it increased plundering, he issued another general order saying, stop that.
That one didn't get much play in the Confederacy, the follow-up general order.
No, of course not. Yeah. So, again, the reception of that, they don't care what Pope's intent is, right? They're focused on
the response was they had just finished agreeing on a prisoner of war cartel just before this got going. And the reaction in the Confederate, the reaction to Pope's statements was such that they exempted Pope and some of his subordinates. They said they would not be treated as prisoners of war if they were captured, because they weren't behaving as soldiers. They were behaving as people operating outside the laws. The words they used was civilized warfare. The words civilized and savage occur again and again and again in the Confederate coverage of what Pope was doing. And they said, yes, of course he came from Missouri, where these things had been going on before. We got Francis Lieber's Code of War because of this kind of thing in Missouri. That's what prompted the Code of War that Lieber put together. How do you deal with these civilians? What are they? Who's a civilian? Who isn't? Who's a soldier? Who isn't? What will we accept? What we won't accept? Mm-hmm. But the reaction to Pope Pope he joined Ben Butler as the two great evil figures in United States uniforms. I mean, they specifically yoked him to Ben Butler and said they were indicative of the kind of war that the United States was going to wage, which had this, that it's bad enough if he's going to hang civilians who helped the army, but they also yoked it to emancipation. What they want to do is destroy our slavery-based social system. That's what they want to do. And so Pope gets tied into that because of what Congress and Lincoln were doing apart. The Confederates put it all together. It's all happening at the same time. And so they put it together as part of a broader Union effort to incite servile insurrection in the Confederacy. And they used that charge. Davis charged the United States with that. The Confederate Department of War charged the U.S. government with that in the course of this period as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's important to understand is I agree with all of that. But, Pope himself, it's sort of like the results redefine the intent in the scholarship, right? So, for instance, Pope did agree that the war should destroy slavery. He was not in favor of arming Black soldiers, and his general orders didn't talk about emancipation of Black soldiers. Didn't mention it at all.
Didn't even mention them.
Right. So, I mean, again, I think it's important for us to understand it's both and, right? Pope was not sort of this forward-thinking mouthpiece of the Republican Party, in my view, because the Republican Party was very concerned with emancipation and Black soldiers at that point. And he would not touch it. But at the same time, everything Gary just said is true. So the results were the results.
He had a very utilitarian view of getting rid of slavery. It would hurt the Confederates if he got rid of it. He didn't give a good goddamn about Black people, but killing slavery would help the United States war effort. I mean, it's just very practical in his view there.
Mm-hmm. Well, Pope's having some issues with logistics and getting his army together and kind of solidifying their place in the field. Gary, what's the Army of Northern Virginia looking like coming off of the 7 days campaign, going into this stretch into the early days of heading towards Manassas and such? Are they a consolidated force not only because of the rhetoric but because of where they are? Or
well, they're because of who's in charge now is a big. I mean, the 7 days is a really fumbling victory for Lee. It's not some masterpiece on his part. And one of the reasons that it was difficult is that it had this command, top echelon of command, that was just a bunch of major generals commanding divisions. There's not a unit of organization larger than a division in the army that Lee is commanding outside Richmond. And so the first change he makes is to weed out a bunch of the losers in the high command and sends them to a place that doesn't matter. Just send them across the Mississippi River. Who cares? Nothing out there matters anyway. So there goes Theophilus Holmes. There goes UG, John Bankhead Magruder. They all head west to the dumping ground of the Confederacy. And there's no core unit yet in the Confederacy. The United States had one. The Confederacy Congress wouldn't bring that until later in 1862. But he in effect created core. He called the right wing and left wing, Longstreet's wing and Jackson's wing of the Army. Essentially treats Longstreet as his senior corps commander, Jackson as his second senior corps commander. Longstreet's always senior to Jackson. And all the cavalry's under Jeb Stuart. That's the key organizational change that Lee makes. It's now a streamlined high command with just three principals as his key subordinates, which is infinitely superior to having this gaggle. W.H.C. Whiting is another one of the division commander he heads south toward North Carolina. But that's the key thing that Lee does. And the other thing that he does is, and the 7 days does this, it indicates that there is a new culture, at least in the process of being created, and that is an aggressive culture, and that suited the Confederate populace very well. Go smite the enemy, inflict damage on the enemy as much as you can. Don't just sit and wait for them to do whatever they're going to do. Do something to them. And Lee is doing that as well. So he's restructuring the high command, and he's also inculcating within the officer corps in the Army of Northern Virginia this more aggressive frame of mind. It's a wonderful contrast. It's actually what Pope's trying to do in the Army of Virginia in some ways. Pope's also, when Pope says we come from the West, a lot of what he said actually makes sense. And it's a direct insult to McClellan, which McClellan deserved, in my view, in many ways. Pope wants a more aggressive army than McClellan had in the Army of the Potomac. Pope actually, in some interesting ways, is trying to do some of the things that Lee was doing in the Army in Northern Virginia.
Yeah, and actually, Gary, I mean, that the speech that Pope's so famous for, right? His address to the troops, where he's an ass, yeah. So, I mean, he had said the same thing to all of his corps commanders before, and finally he issues that address to the whole lot of them because he's not getting the aggressive results he wants from his corps commanders.
And he's right. I mean, what he's telling them to do. Abraham Lincoln certainly would have agreed what he was telling. Abraham Lincoln wanted some army to behave the way that Pope wanted his army to behave. And I didn't focus on the North, but I looked at a lot of Northern newspapers were quotations from them were reprinted in the Confederacy, which added grist to the Confederate mill of how awful Pope was. A lot of Northern papers said, yes, Pope is doing what needs to be done in Virginia. Finally, somebody is doing what needs to be done in Virginia. The retrospective bashing of Pope is interesting. I mean, he's never, despite what KT might write or what many other people might write, I can't envision a time when Pope isn't sort of a throwaway laugh line among what, kind of the non-professional audience for the Civil War. John Pope is easily lampooned. But he was actually a serious figure and a really important one, I think, in a number of ways, even though he's only around for a couple of months in Virginia, but he leaves a pretty large imprint in some ways.
Do you think that Pope's command would have been a little different if he was commanding a consolidated force like the Army of the Potomac? And he's got something to maybe work with a little bit more than so this guy's like aggressive, and now he's got a
look at his subordinates. How would you like to inherit that group of subordinates? Here, the thing, and I don't mean to tread on KT's turf too much here. The Army of Virginia is not an army. It's three pieces thrown together and called an army. It is not really an army in significant ways, I think.
Right. And I mean,
and his subordinates, who the hell would want to work with them? God,
you don't want to work with Sigel?
Well, I mean, and Sigel is not, Sigel is really bad. And he is leaking to the presses, it's just his level of, I think, insubordination is really appalling. But before him comes Fremont, and Fremont won't even submit. Because he technically outranks Pope. And so he's gone and he absconds with all of the papers, so that administratively it's impossible to even know where the First Corps is, who's in charge, what it's doing. I mean, that level of, again, insubordination is truly mind-boggling. So yes, Pope gets a bad reputation, but I mean, when Gary says his subordinates were bad, they were bad. I mean, it's not just that they were ineffective, which they were. I mean, Banks was horrifically ineffective, but it's that they actively worked against Pope.
He has three guys at one time or another who are poster boys for appointments to military command for political reasons. He has Sigel and Fremont and Banks. I mean, they're soldiers for one reason, because they're checking boxes that Lincoln needs to check to keep various groups on board with the war effort. It's if McDowell's your best card to play, you don't have a very good hand. And
he really is. I mean, McDowell is definitely the most organized, and McDowell can't even get the essential messages communicated to Pope in time for him, to fight the Battle of Second Bull Run. So. Yep. I mean, it really is appalling. Banks, when you could just look at the official records. You don't have to look at the manuscript materials like I did. And what you'll see is Pope just trying to get Banks to act in the most basic way a corps commander needs to. And Banks always just turns around to his subordinates and says, well, you do it. Right. I mean, there's just no ability for him to command at all. It is really striking. And then Halleck comes in. And I think, everyone has some hope that maybe Halleck can do something to coordinate, to get McClellan under control, to coordinate all of these moving pieces. And Halleck, I think it stunned me when I sat down and read the materials to see how Halleck responded. He was overwhelmed, and I think that's understandable. But he literally said to Pope at one point, just think about all of the telegraph materials I have to deal with, and then tell me how I'm expected to communicate with you at all.
And McClellan literally wants Pope to fail. Not maybe wants Pope to fail. Right. He writes it to his wife. He wants Pope to fail. Pope, so he's got this Star Wars bar scene group of principal subordinates. He's got McClellan who wants him to fail, and he has Halleck who's just sort of dithering in Washington in some ways. It's really, if it had turned out, it would have been miraculous if it had turned out any other way, I think, for Pope, really and truly.
Agreed.
Wow. I'm just picturing a more Kunstler painting now of that scene in the Star Wars bar. That would have been amazing.
He's got his cast. He's got the perfect cast to put with McClellan knocking on the door to get in. That would be
that'd be amazing. I would buy that. I got a question here. I know a lot of Carney fans are going to show up tonight. And there's a couple people in here with Carney. There's some New Jersey people I know are going to show up tonight. What do you think of Carney in there also, KT?
I don't know. Gary, you have a Carney opinion? I don't know that I have a strong opinion about it.
He's very quotable. He's very quotable. Yeah. And I have a soft spot in my heart for Carney because he loathes McClellan so much. So that's entirely, Carney is certainly an outlier in terms of the culture that McClellan created in the Army of the Potomac, this culture of caution, of not doing something until everything is right. Carney never buys into that. He's an absolute outlier there and is an aggressive officer in a lot of ways who comes to a very sad end at Chantilly, of course. But Carney is not far enough up the food chain to make any difference in what's going on for Pope. He's just not.
No, I think Carney's solid. And he's certainly, when he's killed, there's certainly an outpouring of affection for him. I think he was really well liked. So I think he was solid, but I would agree with Gary. He's just not high enough in command to really make a difference.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Gary, what's the performance like on the field for this revamped Army of Northern Virginia? Now we're consolidated, we're ready to go. I think the performance, it's not flawless, but it works very well. And Jackson performs in his semi-independent fashion very well in his famous march around Pope to Manassas Junction. James Longstreet did what he did very well, which was orchestrate very large tactical offensive movements on battlefields. He'd done it at Gaines's Mill. He did it here. He did just what he was supposed to do. And Jeb Stuart did a good job as well. It helped that the cavalry that Jeb Stuart was facing was not really even cavalry because of the reasons that KT gave and some others. But I would say that as a sort of shakedown cruise, to use a metaphor that doesn't really work, this campaign justifies Lee's choice of all three of those guys to be his principal subordinates. I think that this shows that he made good choices and he got a really excellent result on the battlefield at Second Bull Run, and one that if the Confederacy didn't have time to really digest it because events were moving so quickly. They're across the Potomac River so quickly after Second Bull Run that the focus just shifts to what's going on in the United States. It sort of gets lost in the shuffle, except for people who lived in the Shenandoah Valley. They were really happy to have what happened in that campaign. And they gave Jackson most of the credit. Jackson is still the most famous officer in the Confederacy at this point. That's something else that Second Bull Run begins to change. Lee begins to go up. The smart people in the Army by the end of this campaign, I quote a number of them in my essay, they're not confused about who's really in charge and who's responsible for what's going on. It's Lee, not Jackson. But Jackson gets a lot of the credit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
go
Peter
ahead.
Luebke's essay, I would also just, for folks who want not exactly a contrasting opinion, but I think, that Peter goes into a little bit of the sort of meandering movement of the Confederate Army that I think the results were good, with a little bit of slowness and lack of coordination along the way. I mean, I think it's the campaign's a great example of Lee testing out his first offensive foray into northern Virginia and turning eventually into the North. So I don't think it's perfectly smooth, but certainly the result is good.
No part of it is. I mean, the 7 days is a clumsy effort in many ways. I think it's indefensible that he stayed north of the Potomac after Harper's Ferry fell. I have no idea what he thought was going to happen there. Nothing good could have come from that. The Army was exhausted. Straggling and desertion were a huge problem for the Army in Northern Virginia. There are only probably 35,000 of them at Antietam. I mean, but so no, in this shakedown, in this one long sprawling campaign, Lee makes a lot of mistakes, but I think on the whole, it's the positive side of the ledger clearly is more important than the negative side. And the key thing is that he's got his command structure in place, and he's really and a different frame of mind in the Army. I mean, there's no doubt that that's there. And we treat the response to really understand the Confederate response. It's almost essential not to treat this as three distinct battles that aren't tied together, because they treated them. I mean, when the dust settles in all of this, the frontier is the Potomac River, essentially. And when it began, it's 5 miles from the Confederate capital with an O, not with an A. That's how Confederates looked at this. It's sort of miraculous. The military frontier is back where it was in 1861, which is a huge change, hugely important, especially because it came at a time when the war was going to hell for the Confederacy everywhere else. I mean, just disastrous in the Western theater, disastrous along the South Atlantic coast, even disastrous where I grew up in Southern Colorado, Northern New Mexico. Even Henry Sibley's insignificant nothing campaign came to a disaster outside Santa Fe. There's no good news for the Confederates anywhere. And then Lee does this in Virginia, which is one of the reasons why he and his army become so critical to Confederate perceptions about how the war's going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had an ancestor in the 107th Pennsylvania who was mortally wounded at Second Bull Run. And when I saw that he passed on September 1st, I was like, wow, that's not too far away from Antietam. And, like when you really look at it, and it's almost like I started looking at it like you're telling us to, Gary, where I'm kind of looking at it like you would like the Overland Campaign in 64, where it's this hop to one place to another.
It is sort of like the Overland Campaign. It just covers a bigger, I mean, it operates on a broader strategic landscape than the Overland Campaign. But it's, I mean, and John, one of the ways, I mean, I didn't just make this up. I kept reading Confederates who, this is how they looked at it. This is how Lee described it. It's how John Hood described it in his congratulatory order to his troops. It's how a lot of people behind the lines, John B. Jones talked about it this way. Anyway, there lots of people stepped back, looked at this as a much broader campaign, not just this segmented 3 battles. Let's look at each of them in isolation. They're all directly linked, and it's not that big a period over which they play out.
Yeah, I think the point that Gary is making is really important for the whole of the war, is just to go back and look through contemporaries' eyes to understand how these battles and campaigns unfolded. When I'm teaching military history to my students, they often ask, well, how do you know what's a skirmish, what's a battle, what forms a campaign? And they get so used to just kind of Googling and looking and seeing what are the breakdowns on, from the modern perspective. And I think Gary is really making us pause and understand through contemporaries' eyes how these events unfolded, how they viewed campaigns.
And they almost all, and Jefferson Davis in his, they all make the point that not that long ago, the largest army in the United States was almost in Richmond. And now the armies are in Northern Virginia, almost on the Potomac. I mean, and that's just seismic. And it's in that regard, just in the orientation of the major military forces in Virginia. And when you add to that the things that are going on with emancipation and perceptions of what the United States government wants to do, it's just, this is one of the most important periods of the war. It really is. Things are really changing in the summer of 1862 and the early fall.
KT, how's that infighting going for the Army of Virginia after this fight is over? Because everyone's not working together. Everyone is kind of in, like going at each other's throats even before the firing begins at Second Bull Run. What's happening to this army as this is winding down and they are seeing the effects of having bad logistics and bad internal leadership going on?
Well, I would draw our attention to Bill Marvel's essay. He talks about the fact that this is really a moment where Lincoln's administration is taking a look at who they consider disloyal among their officers, and start thinking about cleaning house, right? He's not going to push out Don Carlos Buell and McClellan till later, till November. However, they're starting to clean house here, starting to look at who to blame and why. They are, of course, very much focused on the connection between politics and the military, and they need military wins, as Cecily Zander points out in her essay, in order to be able to get their political wins and to advance their political agenda. So this is a very critical moment. And, again, if we look at, I make a point in my essay that politics, so meaning Republicans and Democrats, that type of politics, partisan politics, isn't the only kind of politics that matters, because we see such severe infighting among Fremont and Pope and Banks, people who profess to be Republicans. So again, partisan politics isn't the only thing at play here. Egos matter, power matters. But yeah, I think this is an incredibly sensitive moment.
Are you saying Fremont had an ego? Yeah.
Pope had an ego.
Yeah, it seemed like it. Charles has another question here. Did Porter actually cause harm to Pope, or did he just have an ungoverned tongue? Like that question.
I think Porter, if you read what Porter wrote about Pope, again, it's insubordination. It's definitely out of line. One of the points I make in my essay is that Halleck was trying to understand what was happening in the field, and the telegraph wires kept getting cut thanks to Jackson and the cavalry. And so it was very difficult for Pope and Halleck, so Pope to communicate with Washington, essentially. And therefore, when Halleck was trying to understand what was going on, he learned a lot of information through Porter's tainted communications to Burnside. And in it, he just portrayed Pope as an utter fool. And that is just not okay in the chain of military command, right? It's very important to maintain professionalism and discipline. And so I do think it was very harmful, what Porter was saying. I do think he probably needed to be disciplined. However, Porter took the fall for something that really was not his fault. And again, you can read Bill Marvel's essay about that. Pope's communications to McDowell and Porter, they're just indecipherable. His joint order, which is the very famous order that Porter couldn't really figure out how to follow properly. If you read it for yourself, you'll see that he essentially was saying attack, but if you don't feel like that's possible, then retreat. And then when Pope issued his orders, he didn't have the information he needed to know that Longstreet was coming through Thoroughfare Gap. And McDowell and Porter did know that information. And so they knew that if they moved where Pope wanted him to, that Longstreet would be able to slip through. So all of these kind of things were playing out, and the communication was awful. And Porter definitely contributed to that. But I think in trying to follow his commander's orders to the best of his ability, that's not really his fault in the way that it was made out to be.
His behavior, I think, justified his being removed, but he was removed for the wrong reasons. I mean, it's not for what he was accused of doing, but he's a McClellan guy. I mean, absolutely a McClellan guy, and absolutely has the attitude at Army of the Potomac headquarters relating to Pope that is on most people's mind, which is Pope's a fool. Pope, we should be handling this, not Pope. I mean, he was not. He's another one who's not. Not only is each of the principal subordinates in the Army of Virginia not someone you would select, Fitz John Porter isn't behaving as someone who's a good subordinate. Once, as KT said, once he got there, he just isn't. He's loyal to McClellan. He's not loyal to Pope.
Mm-hmm.
Pope's in a tough position. I mean, he really was right from the beginning.
Gary, what's this entire campaign, including 7 days and Second Manassas and Antietam, what's that like in Confederate memory? How does that transpire in that way? Is this basically the anointing of Robert E. Lee, or what does this look like as far as Confederate memory, even post-war?
Well, I mean, post-war, a lot of it is, depending on how late you're going in post-war writings, but a lot of the focus is on Lee and Jackson, of course. And this is Lee and Jackson work, and Longstreet is already being eased out in a lot of the Confederate memory at this point. But it's a very positive take on every element of this broad campaign, including Sharpsburg, as they would have called it, which they said just showed how a much smaller Confederate army could hold off a much larger United States army, stay on the field another day, inviting attack, and then just withdraw on your own. So it isn't it's not a defeat. So you have two great victories and not a defeat, is the way they interpreted this campaign. And at the end of it, just look and see where the armies are compared to where they were when all of this began. and it's a success. They don't. Now, if you go deep enough into the lost cause, you get a lot of criticism of James Longstreet at Second Manassas that's tied to the criticism of James Longstreet at Gettysburg. They say that Longstreet was a bad subordinate at Second Manassas. Lee wanted him to attack, ordered him twice to attack, and Longstreet said no. And that when Douglas Southall Freeman even said that when Lee deferred to Longstreet there, he's setting up the deferring to Longstreet that you got at Gettysburg. They tied those things together. Longstreet did an excellent job at Second Bull Run. Just absolutely an excellent job. But some of the Lost Cause writers treated it as indicative of his unwillingness to do what Lee wanted him to do on various battlefields, and linked it to July 2nd at Gettysburg, and to a lesser extent, July 3rd.
Yeah, I think the memory question is really interesting. It's making me think about some of the reconciliation aspects that come out. So Fitz John Porter, of course, tried to exonerate his war record successfully in, I think, 1878 is when, they created a commission. And I looked through a lot of this material for my Jubal Early book, because Jubal Early was one of the Confederates to whom Fitz John Porter wrote asking for Early to come to New York, where the commission was being held, to provide testimony to exonerate him. And Early did so, actually. So they had a extensive correspondence about the events of the campaign and the battlefield, and Early traveled to New York, even though his health wasn't great, and gave testimony. And as I said, it was successful for Fitz John Porter. But it kind of shows this moment of, the two sides working together in the case of Fitz John Porter. And again, Bill Marvel's book talks more about that as well.
And Fitz John Porter isn't an attractive figure to a lot of Confederates because he's sort of the anti-Pope.
Right. Yeah.
This is another example of the evil Pope.
Yes.
Treating a very good soldier badly. It's just another reason why Pope.
Early and Porter really bonded over not only hatred of Pope, but hatred of Republicans in general. So they found some common political ground.
Yeah.
KT, I want to make sure we plug the book, but also some other people who wrote within it. What were some of your like things and tidbits in the book that you really would like to highlight that you think others have used to make this a very strong piece of writing?
Yeah, I mean, we've mentioned some of them. Peter Luebke's essay on the development of Robert E. Lee's offensive strategy. He looks at some little known parts of Robert E. Lee's career down in South Carolina, et cetera, and how he came to understand the need for the offensive piece of what we often refer to as the offensive defensive strategy the Confederacy develops. When I read his essay, it made me want to incorporate some of that material into my lectures on Lee when I teach undergraduates, because I really feel that it provides us insights when we're trying to explain why the Confederacy adopted the offense at all, right? When they were on the defense, they were defending against Union invaders. I think that origin story for Lee's strategic planning is really helpful. So I would plug that. I think that Jim Martin's essay on looking at the 6th Wisconsin and the connections between Homefront and battlefield in a unit at the unit level, I think is really interesting and important, how the newspapers were used. And also it's just a really good look at kind of first combat for that really famous unit. I also think that Keith Bohannan's essay is, it's a kind of biographical essay of Hood, of John Bell Hood. And actually one of the things, I mean, his work on Hood is really good, but one of the things that interested me was that he detailed command to a staff officer, to his assistant adjutant general of his former unit. And that didn't play out so well in the field. I'm always very interested in looking at staff officers. And so that to me was a very interesting moment. Carrie has an excellent essay on memory for first and second Bull Run. I've already mentioned Cesaly's essay several times. And I'm trying to think of who I'm missing. Oh, and I mentioned Bill Marvel's essay several times. So I think that about covers it. And of course, Gary's essay is okay too.
It's okay.
And John Hennessy.
Oh, John Hennessy. Thank you, Gary. Yes, I do not want to forget John Hennessy's essay. So of course, anyone who's read anything about Second Bull Run has probably read John Hennessy's Return to Bull Run, which is a really marvelous campaign study. Really, it's the only one.
And it's indicative. I mean, to come back to a point I made sooner, the fact that John Hennessy's book, which is more than 30 years old now, is still the book on the campaign of Second Bull Run. I mean, nothing even close to it, And in that period, of course, multiple books have been written about the 7 days, about Antietam. I mean, it's really interesting the degree to which Second Bull Run has been sort of shunted aside in comparison to the other elements of this 3-month campaign.
Right. And I mean, to speak to John Hennessy's essay here, he wanted to write about this topic because it was something he did not cover.
It's not in his book. It's not in his book.
And I think, Gary, you'd probably agree with me when I say that he really demonstrates how 19th century white Northerners in the 19th century held race and slavery as separate, and that this army could come in and they could see the suffering and they could see self-liberation from all of these Black refugees, and they could hate slavery or say the war should destroy slavery. And yet they maintained their incredibly racist views, right? So you see all of that play out in John's stories, and you see the harrowing escape of many of these Black refugees in Northern Virginia. And I mean, the number of Black refugees in this area is just astronomical. I mean, it's just, thousands of people self-liberating.
And one of the most famous photographs of the war is of the family of Black refugees crossing the Rapidan River. That's a theme in my book, The Union War, is how important it is to separate attitudes toward race and attitudes toward slavery. They're absolutely linked, but to assume that somebody who's against slavery cares about Black people is a massive miscalculation on our part, and just doesn't, and misses the elephant in the room in the mid-19th century.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's something that I've talked to students before about in the classroom, where they're making generalizations about the Army of the Potomac. Well, they're freeing people, they must be all abolitionists. And it's like, no, no, we're going to cut that off. That's not the way it is.
They heard Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain in the movie Gettysburg. He explains that that's what it is. We're an army fighting to free men, the first army in the history of the world.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you can't understand Reconstruction at all if you don't understand that people who had profoundly racist views could be anti-slavery.
They didn't think there was unfinished business at the end of the war. Union saved, slavery dead. There's no third now. Total equality for Black people. That's not on the list for most white people. And it was always surprising to my, I mean, 98.8% of the people living in the free states were white in 1860. I mean, 98.8. Even if you throw in the loyal border states, it's still more than 95% of the loyal population was white. Black people lived in the South. People write about, oh, they think they're in a white republic. They actually were in a white republic if you lived in the northern states, but there just aren't Black people around. And to find people with what we would consider the right white people with what we would consider the right attitudes on race is probably going to find a lot of frustration looking for that in the mid-19th century.
So Gary, I got to ask, what's next for you? What are you working on?
I'm still working along on my mother's World War II diary and reminiscences. And I think I'm going to write a short book on Chancellorsville. I've been asked to, and I think I'm probably going to do that.
Wow. Okay.
That's exciting.
That. Yeah, that's very exciting.
If there's enough time I need to take care of the succulents first in the garden, but if there's any time left over.
Chancellorsville comes second to the succulents.
It's important to have priorities.
Rest under the shade of the succulents.
Gary, Chancellorsville, that was the first paper I ever wrote on the Civil War. I think I was a freshman in high school.
That was the first one?
Yeah, I think that was the first paper I ever wrote on the Civil War.
Gary can cite it.
Copy of that. And so you got to write about the weird Stonewall Jackson in that paper.
I definitely did. He's in there.
KT, how about you? What are you working on now, or what do you think about working on next?
Well, I'm finishing up my book called History Wars. It's about the Confederate origins of the American historical profession. And in some ways, it's really a book about how we should look at Jubal Early's writing as what he thought it was, which was history, which was scientific history. And that when we draw stark lines between memory and history, we're missing a great deal of understanding that 19th century Americans had. So that book is wrapping up. It's out with readers, so hopefully it's wrapping up. I shouldn't jump the gun, but I'm hoping that will be coming out relatively soon. And then the next thing I was thinking about doing was going back to environment and health and looking at the Navy in the Civil War era.
Is this going back to your oral exams and comps where you missed the Navy question?
Exactly. Gary, I just want you to believe that I know a thing about the Navy.
The Navy gets no love. I mean, compared to, it just doesn't. It never has.
It doesn't. I mean, I've always been fascinated by the Navy as kind of a place of mixing of various, nationalities and countries. And one of the problems with studying the Navy is that the literacy is much lower. So I'll have to get used to that. Considering I just finished a book about writing in the 19th century, I was inundated with sources. I thought I'd never finish that book. So now I get to kind of have a different problem.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, everyone who's tuning in right now, please remember that pinned at the top of the chat is your link to the Second Manassas Campaign, published by UNC Press. I'm so grateful for both of you coming on this evening. It is great to see you here, and I'm really happy that you both are happy and healthy And thank you again for coming on. I appreciate
Thanks for the invitation, John.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us and for the wonderful questions.
Oh, you know you're always welcome here, both of you. I really appreciate it. And everyone in the audience, I'm sure, appreciates it. We always have big numbers when Gary shows up. So here we go. KT and I are just along for the ride. It's the Gary show.
Right. Big Gary Gallagher fans.
Take care, everybody. Please be safe out there and keep reading.